Variables. What are they? A variable you can think of as a thing. This laptop that I'm using to record this tutorial is a variable. It's stored inside a special container that we like to call laptop. Your phone is a variable. It's stored inside a special phone container. So let's look at variables in the programming world and what that means. Open up Xamarin Studio. Right up at the top, hit File, New, File. Under the C# section, click Sketches, and then head over to xamarin.ios sketch. This allows us to write code and evaluate it almost immediately without going through all the hassle of making an app. Give it any name you like. I'll just call this test. And we are presented with an iPhone 5, which we shouldn't be. Let me go back over to Xamarin Studio. Okay, we're presented with a pane on the left-hand side that says sketch your next great idea. We have an empty pane next to that, and finally we have a console output. So the first thing that we can see in here are something called using statements, and these just import classes or bunches of code that allow us to use them inside of our project. Create some space under it, and the first thing we're going to look at is how to create an integer variable. In C#, this is simple enough. You type int, let's call this variable I is equal to, and then give it a number and end your line with a semicolon. So now we have our first variable, and it's called variable I. It's equal to 6, and it's stored inside a special container called int. Int stands for integer, which means a whole number. So this can contain -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, etc. There are limits to how much an integer can store, so I'll leave you to look that up if you want to know. But for now, just know that's how we declare variables in C#. I could also declare an integer, let's call this best p, I don't know why, and I could leave it unset. Now in C#, this is a little bit dangerous to do, because later on, if we try and access best p, we might get an error, as we haven't actually assigned a value to it. I believe that sometimes C# might just assign a value of 0 to integers that we haven't decided on yet, but it's always best to have it like this one at the top. You make it equal to a number. So what if you want to store a bit of text, a sentence, a word, a few characters, a whole paragraph, even a whole book? Well, we have a different variable for that, and that is a string, and I'm going to call this best. String is equal to, and then we put inside quotes the text we want to store. So I've got Grant here. And you'll notice on the right we have this little console window that pops up and tells us exactly what we've stored. So that's a string. What if I want to create an integer, but I don't want to write int? Well, I can write var. And var is just a general type that infers what it is from what you create. So I'll just explain that with an example. Let's have var sentence equal to. Now if I made that equal to 7, C# would infer that sentence was an integer because it's just a plain number. If I put something inside quotes, then C# would infer that that is a string, and it would make it so. Just know that if you then have a string in your var, I can't then reassign sentence equal to 9. That'll be an error. And over on the right, it says cannot implicitly convert type int to string. So you can't switch between integers, strings, or any other variable type. What you can do is come over to 9 and say dot to string, and you can store it as a string. So you'll notice here it's got a 9 in quotes, which isn't a number, that is a string. But Grant, you say, what if I have a number that is a decimal? Well, there are a couple of ways of storing those. We can use a float. And a float can be 7 point whatever we like. That is a float variable. But if you do that, you'll get an error. And it says literal of type double cannot be implicitly converted to type float, which is a big fancy word, a big fancy sentence to say, please add f to the end of your number. And if you add an f, it makes it into a float. There's another way of storing a decimal, and that's double, and then a number, decimal, and end. And that doesn't require anything on the end of it. Okay, there's one more kind of variable that we should discuss, and it's one we are going to use a lot inside of our programming, and that's a Boolean. Bool, true or false, is equal to, and this can only have one of two values. The first one is true, and the next one is false. So it's either on or off. And this is handy, as you can imagine, if you're making an application that played music. You would have a Boolean that kept track of whether or not your music was actually playing. So is playing would be true or false. And we're going to use Booleans quite a lot. Okay, there's one last thing to do in this little tutorial, and that's something I've already done, but I didn't explicitly say that I'd done it, and that's reassigning to variables. So I can take best string up here, and I can make it equal to something else. So now, if I just type best string, you'll notice over on the right, it now says player. So we've overwritten the original value inside of it, i.e. we can reassign values into our variables. Okay, that concludes this very short and quick tutorial on variables in C#. There are a lot more variables to use, things like lists, but I'm going to cover those much later on inside of the actual course that this beginner section is targeted at.